Hello, welcome to my video, and after a few days of not posting, I will post now. This is a bit delayed, but I want to cover the game between Markus and Alireza Firouzja from round 1 of European Team Championship. It was in match between France and Austria, and they played the Caro-Kann, but Rager chose to play 2 knights defense. This is the one, and Alireza plays bishop h4, bishop g4, which is the most common, h3, and now there's also a possibility to play bishop h5, but after takes on d5, takes, and g4, this might lead to some very complex positions for black, because after bishop g6, bishop b5 is possible, and after knight c6, white has an option of going knight e5, and eventually next move is going to be h4, weakening the pawn structure. For example, if black goes rook c8, white can go h4, and practically black is forced to play f6 here, because h5 is coming next, and the bishop is under attack. So after f6, takes, and maybe d4 next, this appears to be really sharp. It's not completely bad for black. He also has some chances. I played this in some blitz games, and it can become really ugly for white if he doesn't know what he's doing. The most solid way to play this is to capture an f3 and to give up the bishop pair. And after queen f3, which was played, to play e6. Now black is trying to compensate the lack of his light square bishop by putting his pawns on the light squares. This c6, e6 setup is very solid. Now white continues with bishop e2, and black plays d4. Tries to block the center and to keep his pawns on the light squares. He goes back to b1, and now knight e7 was played. Because if he plays knight f6, his control over e5 is not going to be very good, so he wants to go to g6 and to somehow control the e5. And now to anticipate knight g6, white plays h4 here. And now after knight g6, by black, h5 would be good, and after knight e5 to go to g3 and to push f4 next, if the knight doesn't go away. Here black first plays h5. It stops h5, but the weak side of this move is that h5 is very exposed now. White develops by d3, knight g6 now, and queen h3. And now black is trying to get some space on the queen side by a5. And now f4. Now he's trying to limit black on the king side and in the center also. Black tries to challenge this pawn, plays e5, and now maybe Alireza was hoping on f5 to play knight f4 or knight e7, I don't know. If knight f4, then queen g3 would be quite unpleasant, and you cannot capture the bishop because of queen e5. What to do? Knight e7, then just bishop f3, and this knight is uncomfortable on f4 because next move is going to be queen f2 and g3, trapping this knight. So black would have to play g6 here, after which you can take knight g6, because if fg, then bishop f4 simply wins the pawn on g6. So knight g6, and this position looks quite shaky for black, because of the h5 pawn, which is now weaker than ever. Maybe he wanted to go to e7 back, but even then, after knight d2, knight d7, queen g3, now black would have tough time to develop here. After queen c7, knight f3, cannot really castle because of knight g5 and targeting f7 pawn. So black would still have some problems to develop because of knight g5 ideas. In case of c5, then knight g5, and now black cannot develop. He has to go somewhere like knight g8, knight h6, or knight c6, knight f6 to defend the pawn, and maybe then castle, but even then white can open up the position by c3, and with his bishop pair, I think white's chances are much better. Rager took on e5 and knight takes, white castled and knight bd7. Now black's idea is to hold the e5 square, and white's idea is to play around this square and maybe eventually to break this blockade, but mostly to play against h5 pawn. Knight d2, bishop d6, and now a4, stopping any expansions and also securing a potential outpost on c4. Knight f6 by black, and now knight f3, trying to eliminate this very nice knight on e5. And now Alireza plays a dubious move. He plays knight eg4, and that's dubious because it allows pin on the knight with bishop g5. If he tried something like this with the other knight on g4, now this setup is much more solid. There's no danger of a pin, because if bishop g5, now black can choose either f6 or queen d7. Both moves are quite fine. I prefer f6 because it limits the bishop, and next queen d7 and maybe even going for a castle alongside. And those two knights would be really, really good. In case white takes on e5, bishop takes, you cannot capture on g4 because hg, and white loses the h4 pawn. Yeah, in the game this was played, and now Rager plays bishop g5, queen d7, and in case of bishop f6, now gf would be good, and control over g4 is would compensate for this weakness. And also to mention that after a move like bishop d4, you always have bishop c5 at disposal, so it's not possible to capture on d4. So white goes back to d2, trying to get to c4, and also hitting on this knight. Black goes knight h7 here, which wasn't so good. But even in case of castling, which is the best move by engine, after rook f5, this position doesn't look very promising. Next move is going to be just doubling on the f file, and really it's not pleasant to face this. But after knight h7, black gets into plenty of trouble, and white goes knight c4, which seems logical, but better was to play bishop f4. And after exchanging these bishops, black would get in so much trouble, because if you take rook f4, how does black continue? This knight on g4 is not safe anymore. If it goes to f6 from g4, then white takes, and if knight takes, bishop h5. And in case of king d7, then e5 is great, and now you can choose either to capture on d4, on f7 and g7, on h5. It's like a buffet. After this, after bishop f4 takes, probably the best is to go knight h to f6, but even then just queen g3, and it's tough to suggest anything to black where to go. If black goes to castle alongside, then knight c4 might be decisive, because a5 is under attack. You might push b4 next and opening up the position completely. If black goes for a short castle, then e5 is very strong, and now black cannot capture because of rook f6 and the pin. If black goes queen e6, white can capture on f6 and on queen e2 to take on g7, and if king takes, knight goes to f3, and later on he will go rook f1 or rook e1, and the king is very unsafe. So in this position, black would have plenty of trouble to finish his development. Next move is going to be knight c4 for white. That's really not a position to envy black. And also I want to mention that after knight c4 you can play e5. And also I want to mention that you can play it immediately if white is to move in this position, because if you do some random move like rook a7, well, let's not do that, but let's do rook c8. Then white goes e5, and if the knight moves, then you take on g4 twice. If the knight takes, then you take on g7, and now the knight on f6 and rook on h8 are attacked, so that's a pity. This position looks awful. To conclude, this position looks awful. Instead, in the game, Austrian GM played knight c4. After which Alireza took a breath, and now his position doesn't look so bad anymore. He went for a check, bishop c7, and now this position is okay for black. It's around equal, and now black has b5 in his mind to kick this very annoying knight from c4. So first white takes on g4, now queen g4, because the rook on h8 is not defended, and now rook f3. Logically, this is not really a good idea to exchange queens, because it opens up the h-file, and after a move like king g1, black can play rook h5, and after that he can go king e7 and double the rooks. The only way to stop this is to go rook f5, defending the pawn, and after g6 to go to f6, and try somehow to double on the f-file, attacking the f7 pawn. And in case of king e7 to double, but even then black can be calm and play rook f8, after which he takes on g5 and it's just a pawn up, because in case of e5 trying to push e6 to use the pin, now you can take on g5 and on e6 to just exchange one pair of rooks, after which, like I said, black is just a pawn up. Instead he plays rook f3. Tries to double the rooks, but without exchanging queens, which would open up the h-file. Now black castles, and here white plays e5, which is weakening the pawn on e5, and here it was better just, instead of e5, to just take on g4, and after hg to go rook f5. And in case of g6 to go to f6, and if bishop goes to d8 to attack the pawn, then just rook f4. It's either this, to exchange those pawns, or to push g3, and in case of rook g4 to go back to c7. And both sides keep the pawns, but I think it's more pleasant to be black here, because the king is a bit at some kind of danger. But here he played e5, like I said. Alireza doesn't play b5 immediately, he plays rook a e8. Now white takes, and rook g3, trying to get this pawn, but now he gets his b5. And here I think is the crucial moment of the game. Now Rager plays knight d2. In case he took on b5, cb and knight a5, then black would still get his pawn, but the material would be so reduced that it would lead to good chances for a draw for white. In case of rook e5, he would take on g4. In case of rook e2 to attack those pawns on the second rank, just knight b3, attacking back the d4 pawn, and after taking on c2, to just capture, and after rook b2 to go rook c1, and next he would play g6 probably and reduce the material. I think black would probably not be able to convert this. But instead in the game he plays b5, and after knight d2 he takes on e5, rook takes on g4, and now rook e2. And after knight f3 he goes c5, defending this very important pawn. If white takes on b5, then rook c2. After a move like g6, he would take and go rook f6, trying to stop any counterplay with rook c6 or b6. And after taking and rook b1, now black's king just enters. This looks very dominating for black, because the b pawn is not useful, and black is probably just going to pick it up with his king. And black's king is just going to march towards b5, capture it, and maybe even go towards b3 and capture the b2 pawn. Instead of capturing on b5, he played rook c1. Now Alireza takes, and now there's pressure on b2 pawn. King g1, rook b8, and now white tries to kick this rook away. He goes to e6, and now if white tries to defend the pawn by rook b1, now black has a3. And after b3 he has a4. Now the pressure on b3 is really tremendous. It's not possible to hold this. He played knight d2. He wants to get his knight to c4, which is a very nice outpost, but it's going to be just for defensive purposes, to stop the a pawn. Now black took, knight c4, and now he goes back to b8. And now king f2, rook e8. Now White wanted to create something on the H file, but Alireza found a really nice defensive resource. Rook H4, Rook E2, King F3, and now he plays G6. It's defense combined with the offense, because now the threat is, in case of Rook CH1, now he can play Rook E3. And if White takes on E3, then Rook takes E3, King F2, and Bishop G3, with the checkmate on E1. And if he goes to G4, then Rook G3 is checkmate also. And if he doesn't do anything, if he just goes to G4, then Rook G3 again, checkmate, and the same goes for this, Bishop G3 and Rook E1. All hopes for some counterattack were crushed, and White was pretty much forced to exchange rooks. Rook E4, and now he took, and goes to B8. He took the B file, which is very important in this position. King goes to E2, because in case of Rook B4, he can go to D3. King G7, and now Rook A1. Now Black goes to H8, and now if White takes on A4, then Rook H5, he captures on G5, and also G2 is under attack in case he captures those pawns. Rook G5, and after King F2, Rook G3 is very good getting to C3. And Black is a pawn up, White's pawns are not ideal. There's a slim chance to survive this. He doesn't take on A4, he goes to F3. Now Black goes Rook B8. And now again, if you take on B4, now Black has a nice Rook B4, exchanging rooks. And after this, CB4. Now the A pawn is going to run. If White's king tries to stop it by King E2, now you can play A4, so in case of King D3, to play A3, and in case of this, to push and just go Bishop F4, and then Bishop C1, Bishop B2. And in case of this move, I think that Bishop D8 would be enough, because G5 would be hanging and the king can just get closer and closer to the queen side. Instead he plays King E2, he doesn't capture, and now Rook B4. King D3, and now King F8. Rook F1, and now King E7. And now Rook A1 back. If he tried something like Rook F6 here, with Rook B1, Rook C6 probably would be the best, then Bishop D8. Even if he takes on C5, now Rook D1, and now Rook G1. Targeting the G2 pawn, and in case of Rook E5, just King F8, and after King D3 to capture, and the G5 pawn is also hanging to avoid this, because if you take on G5, that might be a problem, because now A4 is under attack, and also D4. Black wants to avoid this, and he would play Bishop C7, and after taking, to take on C2. With two passed pawns on the queen side, Black is winning. So he plays Rook A1 here. King E6 by Black, and now after Rook F1, he goes Bishop D8, attacking the pawn and also stopping Rook F6, but mostly attacking on G5. Rook A1, and now he takes on G5, knight takes the pawn, and now Black plays a really nice move. He plays F5. The point of this move is that Black wants to free the D5 square for his king, to get more active, to put additional pressure to White's king. White took GF, and now knight C6. Rook B6, and he goes back, King D5, and now knight C4. Now Black doesn't go to B4 because it's just a loss of time. He would capture on A4, and after this he would just give a check, and this endgame might be tricky to win. So he doesn't do that. He does Rook G6, trying to hit G2 pawn. In case of Rook A4, now Bishop H6 would be great, and he would capture the G2 pawn later. So instead he plays Rook F1, F4, and now after Rook H1, Bishop H4 is very nice. Because if White takes on H4, he has a check on G3, and after King D2 to take on C4, and in case of Rook F4, he would capture on G2, and this endgame with two pawns up is winning for Black. So here he tries Rook H3, but nevertheless Black takes on g2, knight b6 was played by white, and now king c6. In case of capturing on a4, he would play this, and after capturing fg. And now the g pawn would be promoted because you cannot stop it if king gets closer than g2. So here white took on h4, and after this check, Markus resigned, because if he goes to c4, it's a checkmate on c3. And if he goes down, then black simply takes, and we have some kind of rook ending, which we saw a couple of seconds ago. With rook f4, king b5, if white tried to be a bit active with rook f8, just king c4, and in case of rook a8, just rook g2, and after king d1, get to c3 and collect this pawn. And once you collect this pawn on c2, then with those two pawns on c5 and d4, it's going to be a piece of cake to realize this. So that's it. That was Firouzja's first win on European Team Championship. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please ask in the comment section, and don't be afraid to ask. I will be there to answer you. Have a good day and see you later. Bye bye.